So yes, my name is Martha Sharp, and I've been teaching myself web development for almost a year now. Primarily using online resources, trying to do it for free, see how far I get. Specializing in JavaScript, React, and Redux. So one reason I decided to do a talk on Redux is because my experience talking to other developers, either online or at other meetups and things, is that there's kind of a feeling of animosity towards Redux for some reason. And part of it, I think, is because Redux can be a little challenging to learn, to wrap your head around how it works and why you need it. It can feel a little bit like this, actually. So how to draw an owl. You draw some circles and draw the rest of the owl. And you know, so you learn, you read some articles, you learn kind of the basic concepts, you're like, oh yeah, that sounds great. And then you try to actually use it and you're like, what is going on here? I have no idea how to do this. So that's one reason why a lot of developers might want to do away with it altogether somehow. But I found it very helpful in my own experience and projects. So let's start with something very basic, which can still be kind of confusing. What is React? What is Redux? And what is react-redux? They're actually three different things. And sometimes you hear them going together so often that you might think Redux is part of React, or they automatically go together somehow, and that's not the case. So you have JavaScript, which is the programming language. This is the only language we're talking about here. And React, react-redux, and Redux are all separate packages, separate libraries that you can install when you're using JavaScript. React is a JavaScript library that is, I've got this strange little black box down here.
Just click on it, say don't show or something like that, especially because you share the screen.
Okay. It's right here, it's like this black box. Oh, I see, it's like a picture-in-picture thing. Okay, so you don't, we like to the other way better, that's okay. So React is a JavaScript library that's used for building user interfaces for single-page applications. It's very fast, very popular, very wonderful. Redux is a state management tool, and it's also its own JavaScript library. And you can use Redux just with JavaScript. You can use just React with JavaScript. But if you want to use them both, you need this third thing called react-redux that helps you connect your React app to the Redux store. So just clarifying, three different things. And you need to install both of these packages if you want to use Redux in your React app. So before I go into what Redux is and how it works, what's the basic problem that it's going to be addressing? That any libraries or languages or whatever needs to address in the modern web development. Single-page applications are becoming more and more complicated. Data coming from all over the place. There we go. Data everywhere. You have data in local storage. You have data coming from the server side. You have data that's determining the UI and tabs, pagination, spinners, all that stuff. And the data is constantly changing, and it's all changing at different times. The changes are coming from different places. So you have mutation and asynchronicity equals Mentos and Coke. It's just a big mess. This, by the way, is a comparison straight from the Redux docs. I didn't make it up. This is what he says. So mutation, the constantly changing data, asynchronicity happening at all different times, and they can get very confused. So how do you deal with this situation? One thing that both React and Redux use is state. So what is state? basically, it's an object. It's an object that contains the data that's needed for the application, specifically the data that can change over time. That's the most basic explanation of what state is. And just React does a very good job of dealing with the situation. One of the reasons it's very popular is because it's very fast and efficient. And one reason it's very fast is because it deals with changes in the virtual DOM before it makes changes to the real DOM. It's component-based, it's state-based, so it has different components, and when there's a change in state, it makes that change in the virtual DOM, and it does a shallow comparison between what the previous DOM looked like and what the new DOM looks like, and then it only changes what it needs to change in the real DOM. So that's what makes it very fast and efficient. But how you manage state, where you put it, is still it's very unopinionated. You can make your own choices. Now, this shallow comparison that happens is one reason you don't mutate state directly. Now it says this.state because it's usually in a class component. You don't. Anyway, I won't get into that. But so if you're doing a shallow comparison, what the previous state looked like and what the new state looks like, but you're mutating the previous state, they're always going to look the same because you just changed the original, so you have nothing to compare it to. So no changes happen if you mutate state. Plus, if you don't mutate state directly, you have time travel debugging. You can go back step by step and look at how state has changed over time to see where your problem is. So those are the two reasons you don't want to mutate state. So if React does a really good job with this already, then what's the deal with Redux? Why would you want Redux? Well, one thing, as I said, you can use it without React. You can use it just with JavaScript as a state management tool. But you can it also helps organize state. Basically, what happens in React, sorry, I'm gonna slow down here. What happens in React, you have all these components, and state can be passed down from parent to child through inheritance, okay? And it's the same with actions that can change state. They can go up through that same hierarchy to cause a change in state. So data trickles down and actions bubble up, basically, in React. This, oh, let me just, yeah. So with this, you see, you have a pretty simple application here. You only have 5 components, right? So it's not a huge deal to hand state down. Each component can even deal with its own state locally as well. Each component can have its own state. So let's say this component has some state in it, some data, that these 2 components are dependent on, and it hands it down. But then, let's say you realize that this component needs access to that state too. You can lift up that state to the mutual parent, and then it can get passed down all over the place. So you deal with it locally, or you can lift it up as needed in plain React, right? But once again, this is 5 components. What if you have 25 components? What if you have 125 components, right? Like, applications get really huge, and you can have really big teams working on the same application as well. So that's where Redux can be very, very helpful, because it gives you the Redux store, which ends up being the source of all truth. It's where you store all the state, all the data you need for your application, so that any component can have access to it. So once again, componentry with just React, and actions are going up, data is trickling down. But what about these components? How do they communicate? Whereas with Redux, you have one store for state, and any component you connect to the store has access to that state, and can send actions that can change the state. So these are the three basic principles of Redux. The single source of truth, the Redux store, has all the necessary data for the application. The second principle is state is read-only. That means you're not mutating the original state, the previous state, and actions happen one at a time to change a state. So it handles with that mutation and asynchronicity problem that we talked about earlier. And the third principle is changes are made using pure functions. So that reduces or minimizes side effects. Okay, so that's a basic background of what we're dealing with and the problems and such. So how does Redux actually work? Redux takes state. Redux comes from the word, reducers, Redux. So that's what they named it after, because that's the key element in Redux, is the reducer. You have the app's state, which is a simple object. You have an action, which is also a simple object, usually with a type, which is just like the name of the action, and a payload is typically called a payload, which is whatever data is necessary to cause that to update state, basically. Both of those objects get passed to the reducer, state, the previous state and the action, and then it goes through some kind of conditional statement, switch statement, to find the action define the correct action and make the change to state, and it returns a new state. So that's the basic setup of Redux. This is like the circle, like drawing the owl thing. You get the little circles, like, oh yeah, that makes sense, and then you try to work with it, and like, wait, that doesn't make sense at all. Oh. But that's okay. So the basic data flow then in a react-redux app is some kind of action is triggered in the UI or in the app, like clicking a button, choosing something from a drop-down menu. And then that event triggers an action. Like I said, the action has a type and a payload, usually. The action is dispatched to the reducer. The reducer takes the previous state and the action and returns a new state. And then that state, with the shallow comparison we talked about before, whatever is different in the previous state and the new state updates whatever components are dependent on that element of state, property of state. Basic data flow. Okay, so let's see it in action now, okay? Because this is what I found learning Redux is all these little diagrams and explanations and charts only helped with just the abstract concepts, but when I actually went to try to make something with it, it was an extremely different experience, and all that abstract information didn't necessarily help me. So for this presentation, I made a simple to-do app. And yeah, so basically you add a to-do, and it goes onto the list, and you can delete it. Now, one amazing thing about, sorry, I flashed thing. You're not having a seizure or anything, I'm just swiping. One amazing thing about Redux that I just love is Redux Dev Tools. So this is Redux Dev Tools, and you see I already have two actions in here, add to do and delete to do. And you can actually see, yeah, this is the most recent action. The action type was delete to do, and the payload was 0. So the payload was the index of the to do I was deleting. And it shows you the current state, but you can time travel it here too. So add to do, the state looked like this. Walk the dog, right? And then it shows the difference between the new state and the previous state. So walk the dog was added, in this case, walk the dog was deleted. So yeah, Redux Dev Tools are miraculous and wonderful. And of course, there's all these different features that I've never even used before, so I'm sure there's more awesomeness that I haven't even uncovered here. So if we go to the code, okay, what happened? I'll trace it through again here. So here's the component, and okay, so here's delete to do. Here's the button I clicked where I sent the index of the to-do through props. So props, anyway, a component gets state or the action creators through props, right? So I did props delete to do and then put in the index. From there, it went to the action creator. So let's look at what it is. So here, an action creator is basically a function that creates an action, and the action is an object. It returns an action. So type delete to do payload index. And then from there, it goes to the reducer. And the reducer, like as I said, takes state, the previous state, and the action, goes through the conditional statement to find the right action here, delete to do, and then returns a new object, because state is an object, which only changes what I want to change instead of the entire thing. I actually have accidentally mutated the original state before, and it was terrible. But but I had Redux dev tools to help me and show me my error, like what just happened. All my state just got wiped out except this one thing. Oh, okay, and I knew how to fix it, so it was great. It was very helpful. So that's basically what I demonstrated here is the UI event, the action, reducer, the state, and then the new state gets returned back. All right, so some other questions that come up with Redux. I actually did a post on LinkedIn saying I was doing a talk and asking what kind of questions come up. One question is when to use Redux, right? And you really can use it for anything. You can use it for a tiny little to-do app like that. The downside is it actually takes a little bit of doing to set it up. You have to install the dependencies and set up all your files and connect everything together. So there's a little commitment at the beginning to set it all up. So for that to-do app, I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have used Redux. It's just fine with like 2 components. But I've used Redux with an app with like 10 components, and it's extremely helpful. And it makes things easily scalable as well. So in that project, it started out smaller, but then I kept adding features with new components. And it was a stress-free situation because I knew any component I added, any feature I added, I could connect it to the Redux store and it would have the data it needed without having to do a crazy passing around of data through component tree. Okay, another question is when to use local versus global state. Because in a Redux app, like a react-redux app, you still use local state in each component. And I actually have a good example of when to use it in my to-do app. Oh no, this is, sorry. Right, so here I actually have some local state. Because this is where you do the input in the to-do. So like when I type here, it shows up in the input field, right? And that's because I'm making a change to the local component state. Handle change here is setting the local state so that I can see what I'm typing. But no other components, none of the rest of the application cares about what's in the input field, okay? So that's one of the questions to ask whether you use local state or global state is, does any other part of the application care about this data? Now, the data that the application does care about is when I click the submit button. Then suddenly it cares about what I have in that input field. So that's why I have 2 different things here. I have handle change, which sets the local state, and handle submit, which does add to do and passes the value as the payload. So, so local versus global state. What are middlewares? Is it what are middlewares or what is middleware? That's my question. But anyway, I said what are middlewares. Middleware is they're basically more packages you can use with Redux that help adds functionality. So for example, Redux Thunk is a very common one, and it allows you to do asynchronous actions and your action creators. So for example, in my to-do app, if I was sending this data to an API, if it was connected to a database, I would use Redux Thunk so that I could first do an API call and then dispatch the action instead of just waiting for the response before I dispatch the action, basically. And there are other middlewares that I haven't used yet. There's Redux Saga, and there's Redux Logger, but I haven't used that since I discovered the dev tools. But anyway, okay, one big question is about Redux boilerplate. People complain about how much boilerplate Redux requires. And there are ways to minimize it. For example, the actions, you can actually dispatch them inline instead of making action creators and functions to dispatch them. However, the boilerplate I actually see as a pro. Why? Because it helps me keep my app organized, especially as it grows and grows. I love knowing where state is, where the actions that cause a change in state are, instead of having to search through my components to find where I have that piece of state and what's causing the change and everything. So I appreciate the organization that the boilerplate brings. I kind of compare it to buying a bookshelf. You know, I mean, you could say that a bookshelf is just more stuff and it's going to take up more space in your house. But if I don't get a bookshelf, I'm going to have just books stacked up all over the place, and I'll have to search through my whole house to find the book I'm looking for. So it helps keep things organized. I know where to go to find something, and that's how I feel about Redux boilerplate as well. So yes, so that, in a nutshell, is how Redux works, the problems it tries to solve, and also why I've appreciated it so much in my own projects. So that's it. Are there any questions? Yeah.
I'm new to this world, and I'm just now getting into Redux. Went to a boot camp, graduated in December. They didn't teach Redux, but it is something that I need to know as I go into job interviews. So I've been trying to teach it to myself. But then I hear all this contradicting, information of, well, there's no point in learning Redux because hooks and context is gonna kill Redux. So I was wondering if you had an opinion, or if anyone else does, about taking the jump and go ahead and putting the blinders on, learning Redux thoroughly, and save hooks and context for later, or...
Right. I'm glad you asked that. I figured someone probably would, because it's also very common. That's the buzz, is that Redux is dead and the context API is making it all better. Something that the React Context API does, let me see if I can go back to, okay. So handing information around, right, handing data around. If a component, I said this component wants state from this component, and so I put it up in the common parent, right? Now something that the context API can do is it can basically wrap this component in a provider, it's called a provider, and then other components can have access to it by connecting through, like there's use context, use reducer, those are the new hooks, right? So that is possible. Now, there was a quote from someone on the Redux team actually talking about context API and how it's not ready, it can't really handle high frequency updates. And he didn't really explain why not, so I kind of looked into it a little bit, and I think the reason is, anyone who knows more can correct me, I think the reason is because in the virtual DOM, when there's a state change in React, I'm pretty sure the entire app updates, unless you specifically go into the components and implement should component mount. to see whether it should actually update or not. And even though, like I said, virtual DOM updates are really fast as compared to like real DOM updates, it still can cause it to slow down functionality issues. So I think that's why he said it's not ready for high frequency updates. Whereas in Redux, any component that is connected to the Redux store is basically, it's basically automatically should component mount. It's only updated if the state that it's dependent on change, if its props change, basically. So I think that's that. And I've actually, it's so funny because I started learning the use context and use reducer for one of my projects, and it was so similar in terms of the steps you take to connect the components. It was so similar to Redux that I thought, well, why don't I just use Redux then? You know, since that's what I'm already familiar with using. I like the organization. I love the dev tools. So I think news of Redux's death has been greatly exaggerated, like many things in web development, right? When people want something to die, they might jump the gun a little bit. But that's not to say that, React is continually improving. Like, that's not to say someday it will get good enough where you don't necessarily need Redux, but for scalability, for working on it, collaborating with a team, for large applications, it still seems like the best bet. How to make it less painful to learn? That is the question. I was basically determined to learn it, so I went through a lot of tutorials, just repetition and gradually getting the hang of how things are passed around and stuff. And you might think it's worth learning, or you might wait to see if your job requires it, or I don't know. I was just determined for some reason. I love the idea of one store that manages state. And I think there's also like a twisted part of me that likes a challenge. I hear how hard it is, I'm like, oh, I gotta learn it. So anyway, great question, awesome.